39 years ago, in a single afternoon, a city released nearly 1.5 million balloons into the sky. What came next will be talked about for decades. Not because of the balloons, but because of everything they touched on their way back down. Cleveland, Ohio, 1986. If you wanted to understand what that place felt like at the time, you had to understand what the decade before had done to it. Through the 1970s, Cleveland lost a quarter of its population. Factories shut down. Whole neighborhoods hollowed out. The jobs that had built the city simply disappeared, and the people who depended on them followed. What was left behind was a place that had stopped believing in itself, and a country that hadn't noticed. The jokes came fast, and they stayed. Newsrooms across America had a shorthand for Cleveland that was difficult to shake. The mistake on the lake. The Cuyahoga River, which runs through the heart of downtown, had become so choked with industrial waste that it caught fire in 1969. A river on fire. That image followed Cleveland everywhere. The mayor of the city accidentally set his own hair alight with a blowtorch at a public ceremony. Cleveland came within inches of defaulting on its loans. But by the mid-1980s, something was beginning to shift. Slowly, quietly, the city was cleaning itself up. And then, in May of 1986, came the announcement that changed the mood entirely. Cleveland had been chosen as the future home of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, for a place that had spent years being laughed at, that felt like the first real breath of fresh air in a long time. The people who ran Cleveland's civic organizations understood that momentum mattered. A single good story could not undo a decade of bad ones, but it could start to turn a page. George Fraser, the marketing director of the United Way of Cleveland, had come out of the world of Procter & Gamble. He thought in campaigns, in spectacle, in images that could travel far beyond the city limits and land somewhere permanent in a national conversation. He wanted something that would make the rest of the country stop and look at Cleveland not with pity, but with genuine surprise. He found his answer in a story out of California. The previous year, Disneyland had released 1 million balloons simultaneously into the sky over Anaheim to celebrate its 30th anniversary. It had made the Guinness Book of World Records and generated the kind of attention that money alone could not buy. Fraser looked at that and saw something bigger. Not 1 million, 2 million, and not Disneyland. Cleveland. To pull off something that had never been done before, you needed someone who had come closer than anyone else. That person was Treb Heining, a Los Angeles-based balloon artist whose entire life had been built around this particular kind of ambition. Heining had been a boy at Disneyland's grand opening, selling Mickey Mouse balloons at the gate. He watched 50,000 balloons lift into the California sky that day and felt something click. He never really left that world. By the time Cleveland called, he had organized balloon releases for the Super Bowl, for the 1984 Olympic Games in Los Angeles, and for the Disneyland anniversary that had set the record Cleveland now wanted to break. When the United Way reached out, Heining was direct about what he felt. For years, he said, people had told him that releasing 1 million balloons simultaneously was impossible. It was like breaking the sound barrier, he explained. He had proved them wrong in Anaheim. Now, Cleveland wanted to prove it on a grander scale still. The planning that followed took 6 months and consumed enormous resources. Heining brought in Tom Hollowak as the project manager, a man who would spend the better part of that year living in Cleveland, working through the kind of logistical complexity most people never encounter. The structure that had to be built in Public Square alone was extraordinary. It was a single piece net the size of a city block, 250 feet long, 150 feet wide, rising 3 stories off the ground. The company that fabricated it was the same firm that built cargo nets for the space shuttle. It had to be engineered to withstand winds of up to 90 miles per hour, which was the local building code requirement. Nothing about this was simple. The balloons themselves were manufactured at a factory in Willard, Ohio, from what Heining described as the finest latex in the world. Each one had to be individually filled with helium, tied off, and fed up into the net, where it would wait alongside hundreds of thousands of others for the moment of release. To fill them all, more than 2,500 volunteers were recruited, the majority of them school children who had spent the preceding weeks selling balloon sponsorships across Cleveland at 2 balloons for $1, with the proceeds going directly to the United Way. Those children became the engine of the event. They gave it a civic quality that no amount of corporate planning could manufacture. By the morning of September 27th, Public Square looked like something from another world. The net bulged above the square in a vast, trembling mass of color. Terminal Tower rose behind it, the tallest building in the city, its familiar silhouette framed by what looked like an impossible cloud. 100,000 people had gathered in the streets of downtown Cleveland. They had come to see history, and from the outside, everything suggested they would. The balloons were ready. The crowd was ready. And somewhere high above the lake, without anyone on the ground yet knowing it, the weather was already making its own plans. The night before the launch, Treb Heining was at the coffee shop of his hotel on Public Square, winding down before an early morning when he saw something that made him pause. Trash cans were blowing down the street outside. The enormous fabric side panel of the balloon structure was snapping and billowing in the wind. A storm had moved through northeast Ohio during the evening of September 26th, fast and violent, leaving behind it rough water on Lake Erie and an unsettled sky. Heining noted what he saw and went to bed. The launch would still go forward regardless. Out on Lake Erie that same evening, two men had gone fishing. Raymond Broderick and Bernard Sulzer were friends, ordinary men, the kind of people who spent their free time on the water because it was where they felt most at ease. They had taken their 16-foot boat out onto the lake and had not come back. By morning, their families had reported them missing. Rescuers located the boat anchored west of the Edgewater Park breakwall, engine gone, possibly capsized by the storm that had come through. The men were nowhere near it. The Coast Guard launched a search and rescue operation on the morning of September 27th. Helicopters went up. Boats spread out across the water. The search was active and urgent, because in cold water, time is the only thing that matters. At exactly the same time, 2,500 volunteers were gathering in Public Square, a few miles away, beginning the final hours of inflation. Two stories were unfolding simultaneously in the same city, in the same morning hours, entirely unaware of each other. One was a celebration. One was a desperate search for two men who might still be alive. Then, around noon, the weather forecast changed. A new front was pushing in from the north, bringing rain and dropping temperatures. The organizers had a decision to make. They could delay and risk the storm hitting during the release with the balloons already in the air. They could cancel and lose everything 6 months of work had built toward. Or they could move the launch forward, beat the weather, and get those balloons up before conditions deteriorated. They chose the third option. The release would happen early. At 1:50 in the afternoon, the net would be lifted. It was a decision made in good faith by people under pressure. It was also the decision that changed everything. The countdown began. The crowd in Public Square pressed together, 100,000 people craning upward, phones and cameras raised for a net that barely seemed able to contain what was inside it. Then the net released. What happened next was, for about 30 seconds, genuinely beautiful. 1,429,643 balloons rose from the center of Cleveland in a single churning mass of color. They climbed above Terminal Tower, above the surrounding buildings, above the city itself, filling the sky with something that looked like a painting. The crowd erupted. A radio DJ covering the launch went live on air and shouted that Cleveland had broken the Guinness Book of World Records. For one brief, suspended moment, the city felt exactly the way it had been promised it would feel. Then the cold front arrived. Helium balloons are designed to rise until the gas inside them disperses enough for them to descend slowly and safely. That is what they do in ordinary conditions. These are not ordinary conditions. The wall of cold air and rain hit the balloons while they were still fully inflated, and instead of continuing upward, they stalled, turned, and came back down. All of them, still full of helium, still perfectly round, still in their millions, pouring back over the city and everything north of it. The shoreway, the main highway running along the lakefront, became impassable. Drivers could not see. Balloons covered the road in a moving, multicolored mass, and cars began colliding. A 10-car pileup was reported on the westbound lanes. Further downtown, streets filled with balloons that clog storm drains and choke the waterways. Burke Lakefront Airport shut its runway for 30 minutes when the tarmac disappeared under a carpet of rubber that had to be cleared by bulldozer before any aircraft could move. In Geauga County, south of the city, the balloons rained down on a pasture belonging to a woman named Louise Nowakowski. Her prize Arabian horses panicked. One was permanently injured. She would later sue the United Way for $100,000. In the days that followed, balloons washed up on the Canadian shore of Lake Erie. They had crossed an international border. But the most urgent consequence was happening in real time on the water. Lake Erie disappeared under the balloons. From the air, the surface of the lake was a continuous mass of color in every direction, and the Coast Guard helicopter crew, searching for Raymond Broderick and Bernard Sulzer, suddenly found themselves flying through what one pilot described as an asteroid field. They could not see the water. The search boats below were no better off. A Coast Guard spokesman told the Cleveland Plain Dealer that it had become impossible to distinguish anything on the surface of the lake. Not a person, not a life jacket, not a signal. "You're looking for an orange life jacket," he explained, "and you have hundreds of thousands of orange balloons. You simply cannot tell." On September 29th, 2 days after the launch, the United States Coast Guard officially suspended the search. Within the following 2 weeks, the bodies of Raymond Broderick and Bernard Sulzer washed ashore. Raymond's widow, Gail Broderick, filed a lawsuit against the United Way of Cleveland and Balloon Art by Treb, seeking $3.2 million in damages. The case was eventually settled out of court for an amount that was never disclosed. Louise Nowakowski, the horse owner, also settled. The fundraiser itself, the event that was supposed to generate significant charitable revenue for the United Way, ended in a net financial loss. Cost overruns had already put the budget deep in the red before the first lawsuit arrived. The debate that followed, and that has never fully stopped, is about what the balloons were actually responsible for. In 2024, Roger Rice, the Search and Rescue Program Manager for Coast Guard District 9, gave an interview in which he stated plainly that Balloonfest had no connection to the deaths of either man. That Broderick and Sulzer had almost certainly drowned the night before the launch, during the storm, and that the balloons had not caused the outcome, only complicated the search. The editor of Cleveland's Plain Dealer made a similar argument in 2023, calling it unfair to describe the event as a horror or a disaster, pointing out that the highway collisions were minor, that Burke Lakefront Airport was a small facility that closed regularly for weekend air shows, and that the core achievement, a genuine world record, was being overshadowed by a narrative that had taken on a life of its own. But there is another question that those arguments do not entirely answer. Even if Broderick and Sulzer were already gone before the balloons fell, there were 2 days between the suspension of the search and the moment their bodies appeared. Whether anyone remained to be saved during those 2 days is something no one can know with certainty. And the obstruction of the search was real, documented, and undeniable. A meteorologist who reviewed the weather data from that morning gave perhaps the most straightforward assessment of all. Looking at the conditions that were present on September 27th, he said, "There was simply no way those balloons should have been launched. The front coming in from the north had a documented history of producing severe weather. The decision to accelerate the release rather than cancel, it was made by people who believed they could get ahead of it. They could not." The Guinness Book of World Records included Balloonfest in its 1988 edition, recognizing that figure as the largest ever mass balloon release in history. It was the only time the event appeared. Shortly afterward, Guinness permanently eliminated the category. Mass balloon releases, alongside sky lantern releases, would no longer be considered for records on environmental grounds. The institution had looked at what had happened in Cleveland and decided some records were not worth keeping. Cleveland's achievement was technically surpassed by Disney in 1994 when the studio released over 1.5 million balloons to promote the film Aladdin, but by then the category itself had ceased to exist, and with it any remaining logic for ever organizing something like this again. Raymond Broderick and Bernard Sulzer were not symbols. They were not cautionary figures placed at the end of a story about good intentions gone wrong. They were men. Raymond was a husband. Bernard was a friend. They went out on a Friday evening in September because they wanted to fish, because that is what they did, because the evening was free. They did not come back. Their families lost them to the cold and the storm and whatever happened out there in the dark, and nothing that came after, no lawsuit, no settlement, no documentary, changed that. After Balloonfest, both Treb Heining and Tom Hollowak resolved that all future events they worked on would be ground-based. No more sky releases. That decision, quiet and private, said more than any public statement could have. George Fraser, the United Way marketing director who had dreamed the whole thing up, reflected on it years later with an honesty that was striking. He called Balloonfest his greatest success and his biggest failure, both at once, inseparable, impossible to rank. That is the kind of assessment that only comes from someone who has sat with something long enough to stop looking for the version of the story that makes them feel better. What the event left behind in law and policy was significant. Connecticut, Florida, Virginia, and Tennessee all passed legislation restricting or banning mass balloon releases. In the United Kingdom, local councils began prohibiting them. Australia moved toward broader restrictions. Environmental organizations, including the RSPCA and the Marine Conservation Society, cited Balloonfest as the moment that forced a real and overdue conversation about what happens to balloons after they leave human hands. How long latex takes to break down in open water and on coastlines. What it looks like to a seabird when it mistakes a deflated balloon for food. What a million pieces of rubber scattered across hundreds of miles of shoreline actually cost the ecosystems that absorb them. The balloons used that day have been certified as biodegradable. Even natural latex can take up to 4 years to fully decompose. Nathan Truesdell made a short documentary about Balloonfest in 2017, and it reintroduced the story to a generation that had not been there. 11 million people watched a version of it the following year. For many of them, it was the first time they had heard Cleveland's name in connection with anything other than sports. Public Square still exists in the heart of Cleveland today. Terminal Tower is still there. The block where the net once stood, where 100,000 people looked up and cheered, looks like any other block in any American downtown. The question that Balloonfest asked, and that none of the lawsuits or reports or editorials have fully resolved, is not whether the balloons killed anyone. The question is simpler and harder than that. It is the question you face every time a large group of people decides that the scale and beauty of what they're doing is reason enough to do it, without stopping to ask what happens when it lands. What responsibility looks like when the harm you caused was not the harm you intended. When everything went according to plan, right up until the moment it did not. And 2 men who went out on the water one Friday evening never came back.